Okay, welcome to this parallel event of the last day of the EUBCE. I'm Giulio Poggiaroni from ETA Florence, and I will moderate this session. I'm now joined by the first panel of speakers of today's event. I would like to welcome you and also the online participants that are following us. So, for the first presentation, we will have a brief introduction from Andrea Salimbeni of the Record Consortium, who's the coordinator of the project. And then we will have an overview of the policy context where we are placing ourselves with this project by Chris Mullins and George Bourliotakis. So I'll give the floor to Andrea, and in the meantime, I remind you to sign the attendance list, and at the end of the event, we will have a lunch break served outside. So Andrea, the floor is yours. You can use the pointer.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. Pointer is working. Yes. My name is Andrea Salimbeni from Records. Record is coordinator of Bike Project. Bike Project is financed by the European Horizon 2020 project funding program, and it started in 2020. So we are approaching the end, and we are trying to summarize parts of the results that we got in the last 3 years. Okay. What were the objectives of the project? The project aimed at facilitating the market uptake and assessing the sustainability in terms of economic and environmental aspects of low-ILUC risk biofuels in Europe. Low-ILUC risk biofuels in Europe, I am pretty sure that all that you are here, you know quite well what they are. They are those biofuels produced by biomass which not affect the indirect land use change, which is quite a critical issue about the bioenergy sector in general. First of all, we have focused on the EU biorefineries. We had to identify the state of the art. What are the biorefineries? How many they are in Europe? I will be very quick to introduce all the data collected, but they will be analyzed and reported in the next presentations. It is quite important to put the light on where we are and what is the biofuels value chain in Europe and the state of development. A lot is produced, a lot of biodiesel and renewable diesel is produced by biomass feedstocks. Most of them are not low ILUC, apart from, for example, they use a cooking oil, which is considered as an advanced feedstock, and partially from tall oil, for example. A niche market is related to the bioethanol, still much lower production compared to biodiesel and renewable diesel. Second generation ethanol, which is that considered a low ILUC risk biofuels, is almost not produced commercially in Europe so far. Another important and interesting sector is represented by the biomethane production as biofuel itself and as a precursor of liquid biofuels as well. Be very quick. This is a summary of the EU policy framework, which will be approached and described by the leaders of the work package on policy framework of Bike Project. So I will be very quick in just showing the slides about what have been done and what are the policy directives that affect and influence the sector. In particular, we are talking about the implementing regulation 2022-996, which also includes the list, updated list of the Annex 9 on advanced biofuels. What we focus on are these: non-food crops grown on severely degraded lands not suitable for food and feed crops. This is the first category of low ILUC risk biomass feedstock that we take in consideration. This is the second one, intermediate crops and catch crops and cover crops. So they are grown in areas where there is a short vegetation period for food crops, so that there is land and time to cultivate also biomass for biofuels production. The bike projects, as a summary, we focus on cover cropping, crop rotation, and cultivation on unused, abandoned, and severely degraded land as the conditions for these biomass feedstocks to be low ILUC. To analyze the sector and the potential of the sector, we have identified 4 case studies and 2 value chains, two case studies per each value chain. One is the value chain on cultivation in unused land, and the other is the productivity increase by cover cropping. We have identified, in particular, these 4 case studies led by 4 different partners. ENI, that leads the castor oil cultivation in unused and abandoned land for HVO production. Record, that leads the case study on perennial crops cultivation in the same abandoned or degraded lands for second generation bioethanol production. Then UPM, that has a biorefinery working with brassica, cultivated as a cover crop in Uruguay, and CIB, the consortium of biogas in Italy, that is managing the biogas direct model, cover cropping applied to biomethane production. I will be very quick. On these case studies, on the existing case studies, we did an auditing activity. ISCC did, following its own developed model and auditing system, and it was tested on these real case studies. The audit has been performed in particular in Kenya, in Italy, in UK, and in Uruguay. Of course, Peter will show you the results of audits after my presentation and during the event. Then we have assessed also the potential applicability of the case studies in Europe, of course, based on databases and implementation of maps and of the results obtained by experiences in terms of yields and biomass cultivation. And then, of course, last but not least, the sustainability assessment, environmental and economic sustainability assessment of the value chains. As a conclusion, which is not that much a conclusion, but what it is can be considered a starting point. There is a lot to do about low ILUC risk biofuels to unlock their potential. There is an opportunity, a market opportunity for this sector, but many aspects must be clarified in order to ensure that the biofuel sector will see a real sustainable development in the next years. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. Then I would like to invite Chris Mullins from the consulting company Serology to give an overview on the policy context for low ILUC risk biofuels, and later be joined by George from Exergia on the stage. Please, Chris.
Thank you very much, Giulio. Good morning, everyone, especially our youngest attendee. This is a very brave meeting to try to sit to when you're only small. Wow, thank you very much for coming. So I am going to introduce you a little bit to some of the work of Work Package 5 of the BIKE project, looking at the policy context for low ILUC risk biofuel production. Let's see. Okay. To repeat a little bit what Andrea has said, I'm afraid, just to remind you, the conceptual framing for low ILUC risk biofuels is that the climate, the environmental and the socio-economic benefits from biofuel policy can be undermined or eliminated in the case of stimulating agricultural expansion, causing indirect land use change emissions, impacts on food markets, stuff of this sort. The low ILUC risk concept is about providing a certification mechanism to demonstrate that a given, welcome everybody, demonstrate that a given batch of biofuels has avoided causing competition with existing food feed and fabric uses for agricultural outputs. And when we avoid that competition, we say that low ILUC risk biofuel production is additional. It is extra material that's being produced exclusively in order to supply the biofuel sector. And as Andrea indicated, we have production systems that fall into unused land, into productivity increased on existing crops, which Bike hasn't looked at so much, and then into intermediate crops and rotational crops, which our case studies have considered. In terms of the policy framework, we have a well-defined place in the Renewable Energy Directive for low ILUC risk certification as a way for a crop which has been identified as high ILUC risk to get access to the European market. And at the moment, the only high ILUC risk identified crop under the RED is palm oil. So for low ILUC risk projects in the palm oil industry, we have a sort of a defined value proposition. But outside of that context, as we look at low ILUC risk production for other feedstocks and the case studies that we have under Bike, the place in European policy is a little bit less clear. So part of the framing of Bike is to say that we have this idea of low ILUC risk, and we want to look at ways that that can be applied to crops other than palm oil, including crops that can be produced in Europe. And also look at how we can leverage overlaps between what we achieve with low ILUC risk production systems, where they meet some of the policy objectives that come from outside energy policy as well. The first exercise for our bit of the Bike project was to do a sort of a policy stocktake, looking at legal, institutional and policy frameworks that could be relevant to these projects in the European Union. So first off, looking in the obvious place, writing up and confirming the role of low ILUC risk biofuel production within energy policy and in the Renewable Energy Directive in particular. But then looking at the relevance of these types of projects and these type of ideas in other policy areas. So, for example, we might have a low ILUC risk project that involves cover cropping that can reduce nitrogen runoff. Could this be something that could be help with compliance with the Nitrates Directive? Is there a way to generate support for compliance with the Nitrates Directive? For another example, could introducing an intermediate crop help support the development of soil carbon, or things like using biochar could support the development of soil carbon? Could that help meet objectives under something like the carbon removal regulation? So we've had a sort of a structured approach for the punctually titled deliverable 5.1, where we have looked at European policies, looked at examples of how these things have run in certain relevant member states, and identified where there's a sort of a narrative consistency, where low ILUC risk projects go in the same direction as the stated goals of a policy, but without perhaps an obvious specific policy support role. Where there is a value proposition, where actually meeting the targets of a policy could generate value for a low ILUC risk biofuel project, and where there may be a barrier, where there's actually some sort of conflict between other elements of policy and enabling these value chains. And it's all done with a value chain perspective. And finally, as part of that exercise, we've looked at the availability of financing and where agricultural financing tools might be leveraged to support the development of low ILUC risk projects. We have a bunch of thematic areas which are listed on the right, which I will not read through for you. If you would like to look at all of this in more detail, there is a link at the bottom, and I'm sure these presentations will be available afterwards if you want to click that, or if you can remember Bike biofuels, it's not too hard to navigate. So let's see. So based on this analysis of the EU policy framework, we've looked at some of the policies of relevance, and we have produced a series of briefing notes. We have 8 published on the website already, and the next slide will tell me something like 5 or 6 more forthcoming. And as I say, looking at this cross-referencing of low ILUC risk ideas into energy policy, into agricultural policy, in the CAP and such, into environmental and ecology policy, looking at the development of carbon removals policy and the increased focus in Europe on carbon removals, and finally, again, looking at finance. So the 8 which we have already published are looking at the agricultural links, crossover with the common agricultural policy in particular, looking at some questions around legal definitions, some boring semantic stuff about actually how maybe some of the wording around low ILUC risk could be tuned to make it more applicable. A simple example would be that some of the BITE case studies look at perennial crops. We mentioned in the UK, Greece, and wherever else it was, I should know this by now. But in the Renewable Energy Directive, there is language that says that a low ILUC risk crop has to be a food or feed crop. So we just identified places where there's this inconsistency between what you might want to be able to do to have a broad rollout of these ideas and some points of what the language says. We've talked about opportunities for low ILUC risk to be supported at the member state level, in particular the fact that Article 26, paragraph 1 of the Renewable Energy Directive gives member states a certain amount of leeway to adjust the way that they support biofuels to take into account ideas around indirect land use change, and that might be an opportunity to bring some value to this market. We've talked about some additionality measures, which are not currently listed in the European Union's list of additionality measures, but that we have suggested could appropriately be added. We've talked about the role of cropping to control invasive alien species and a little bit about the risk of introducing new crops that could become invasive. We talked about the role of low ILUC risk certification in the context of some of the measures that Andrea mentioned in Annex 9, these feedstocks that get additional support under the RED, and whether low ILUC risk certification could become part of the oversight of that. We talked about soil carbon crediting. We've talked about the way that low ILUC risk intersects with other sustainability measures. And as I say, we have another 6 forthcoming. I'm afraid I don't have anything like enough time to talk about this, even as much as I already have. So hopefully I've sort of covered the takeaways as I went through. I'll just, let's see, was there anything else I should have mentioned? But there's on point number 5, trying to find ways that you can integrate ideas in the low ILUC risk mechanism with some of the ideas in the carbon removals legislation or carbon farming legislation, where you can see an overlap. Some of the same ideas which carbon farming legislation asks you to look at are the ideas that you do look at through low ILUC risk certification. So could one recognize the other, ideas of this sort? So all of this is building up to the development of a supportive framework, which I think is the point where I will let George have his moment in the sun.
Thank you, Chris.
Well, thank you, Chris. So, yeah, I will guide you through the last part of the analysis that we're doing in this work package within the BIKE project. So, starting from the theoretical, I would say, analysis of the policy framework, and then identifying what could be improved in order to have a market facilitation for this concept. Then we're moving to the final part that is devoted to the development of the so-called transferability matrix. So what we're trying to do here, we're trying to learn from the practical examples that we have in the case studies of the BIKE projects, for which I think later on Effie will be discussing into much more detail. So we're trying to have the practical examples that we have showcased in this project, also in combination with the theoretical analysis that we did before, and try to see what has worked, what doesn't work, and then try to upscale this or to have good lessons learned or good guidance to facilitate market uptake of the low ILUC risk concept in Europe in order to meet the 2030 targets, or to see how can we blend this concept within the framework that the path that Europe wants to have. So the analysis is still ongoing. So the idea is that we are going to contextualize a bit the previous policy framework recommendations that we have to see how this does fit within the practical examples that we have from the bias case study, and to identify any barrier that comes in order to that hinder us to allow the effective scaling. And how the transferability matrix would look like. Now, we're trying to also build upon the experience that we have across all work packages of the BIKE project. So We know the criteria that the regulation sets to prove a low ILUC risk concept. So we're going to focus on, we have a separate analysis in work package 2 about the additionality, for example, conditions. So we're going to build upon this analysis that comes with significant spatial granularity, I would say. I think the analysis has been done in NATS 2 level. So we're trying to combine this type of analysis that gives us the opportunity in the first part of the value chain with the analysis that has been carried out within work package 3 that has to do with the availability of the biorefineries and the technologies that are there that could convert the biomass that could be sourced under the low ILUC risk conditions and then converted to biofuels, and also considering the analysis of work package 4 that has to do with the sustainability criteria. So if you combine all these things, you can have like a green heat map of areas where good conditions coincides, and this can then give a path towards the upscale of that particular cases in other parts of Europe. So practically, we would like to see if these good conditions that we can understand that could work based on the analysis of the project could also be replicable in other parts of Europe. And so as to see actually the perspective, the prospects of this concept. Yeah, and so we have also identified here some discussion points, Chris, to wrap up our analysis. So it has been in hierarchical order. So please, Chris, you can maybe.
Yeah. So I don't know. Hopefully, we have a couple of minutes for discussion. It's quite a busy session, but if anyone has any thoughts on these 3 points, how we can use policy to expedite implementation of low ILUC risk projects, especially in the period to 2030, how the value proposition this can be created, whether member state incentives is an important part of that, or whether we look somewhere else. I'm interested in thoughts, which of these low ILUC risk projects actually already have a good value proposition? Does anyone in the audience have any thoughts about a place where they could say, yes, no, this actually works already, and where there's a good coherence with existing policy? And finally, I'm interested in whether in this 2030 timeframe, the intermediate model, the productivity increase model, or the unused land model is actually going to be where it's most interesting to look, or whether it really is evenly distributed through the 3. So I guess, do we still have a couple of minutes, Julia?
Yeah.
Couple of minutes. So yeah, if anyone has any comments or questions, please.
Yes, the micro is coming. You have the micro there.
Hi, thank you very much. And thank you for BIC for inviting us. My wife, Chantel, the president of our organization. We're from Nicaragua and Honduras. We represent 150,000 indigenous people in 4 indigenous reserves. Total areas, about 3 million hectares, of which over 1/3 is currently destroyed. So we basically focus on food security and maximizing our potential here on the planet. We've been working over 11 years on creating the world's highest yielding castor strains. I have samples here to show after. And basically, using our intellectual proprietary intellectual property together with our business model that we call intelligent reforestation and landscape restoration, in theory, the world has 5.6 billion hectares of non-arable land that is currently accessible. We too obviously have 2.1 billion hectares of arable land that we currently use for food production. So we focus specifically on non-arable land, where, as I said, in theory, if we were to cultivate just 20% of the Earth's potential, we would eliminate fossil fuels entirely. As you can see, my daughters are here. Ilana, please stand with your sign. Levanti, baby. So we say no to fossil fuels. We've just come from Munich in Germany, marching with Fridays for Future, and we work with a number of organizations here in Europe. We've moved to Italy also. We'd love to do a project here. We believe 12 of the 14 states, actually anywhere from Portugal, Spain.
Sorry,
Italy.
if you could
Okay.
link
So
to the point, please.
We would eliminate fossil fuel entirely by following what we're here to share with you guys, the world today. Not only would we eliminate fossil fuel entirely and fossil plastics and pollutants, there's so many wonderful things we can talk about, but more importantly, we would be producing food for 3 billion more people. Okay, that means we would effectively eliminate the 11% deficit of world hunger. And this is what we're here to do. And when it comes to electrification, we have a project we would like to do in Kenya, where for just $4 per month, we would be able to electrify every single household. Half of that goes to the actual production of the energy. Another half would go to the maintenance of the grid. Most importantly, we create 1 out of every 5 a job, and we can take non-arable land. 2.5 hectares would give us a permanent job all year round. Okay, so there's immigration issues here. There's lots of things we'd love to participate in. I'd have to give the floor to other people, but we're here, we've been invited, and we're here to basically share with you what we have brought with over 11 years of hard work.
So we hope this was non-ILUC.
Yes, well, thank you very much. I think you've gone a bit above my pay grade with some of that, but I think, I mean, it sounds like a great project. We have been involved with some Castor case studies, so I think that there's hopefully an opportunity to compare notes and look at some of the specifics of those production systems.
Absolutely,
And,
we'd love to.
If your model is something that can be supported better through low-ILUC risk certification, then that would be great to explore.
If there is another question on this, otherwise we move to the next speaker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, it's more a comment than a question. I'm a bit, I don't see very much in the real terms how we can use policy to expedite anything in Europe.
Actually, that's our whole bit.
Yeah. So this was the hope when we wrote this project with Calliope. But actually today, after many interactions with the Commission, I have to say that's the major barrier. In this room, we had a national meeting. The main message from the industry is we do not understand anymore anything. We don't know where to invest the money of the industry to produce the low-ILUC whatever. So it's a very strong signal that came out of the stakeholders. So I wish this to come also from this project as a message. We cannot continue having so many different policy. As you say, coherence, in fact, is a point. And continuously evolving policy. That's a major barrier to any investment anywhere. And in effect is that we're moving to Africa for that reason also, with other systems and other regulations that at least can be better managed and planned by the financial investor. I remind any plant here costs 400, 500 million euro each. So you need really clear conditions to do. Otherwise, the alternatives make or buy. And buy will be the answer, or invest elsewhere.
Thank you, David. So thank you, Chris. Thank you, George.
Can I just make a quick announcement? Hello, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Just an announcement that you can see already. We have a real international audience in this room today, not only European members, European attendees from Europe, but also, as you have listened, developers from Nicaragua and the full delegation from the Nigerian Engineering Society. So I thought this was really, this was really good to interact with you. You feel free to interact during the networkings and the breaks. Thank you.
So I would like now to invite Efi Alexoglou from CRES for the next intervention, and I would also like to invite the next panel of speaker. So which is Efi. I would like to invite Katerina from Record and Peter Avigors from ICC.
Sure. Hello from my side. Thank you very much for the nice event and the invitation to present in the final event of Bike. So it was a journey of 3 years, and I'm going to present you the case studies. As Andrea Salibeni presented, this is the two main case studies that we work in Bike. We work on the first value chains that are uncultivated, in unused, abandoned, severely degraded land. And the second group is productivity increase through improved rotation systems. you have seen this, so I can move further on, but here you can see in more detail the 4 case studies. As you remember in the first presentation, each case study, they follow with an audit. It was one in UK from Miscanthus, one in Italy for biogas done right model, one in Uruguay from Brassica carinata, and we had in Kenya about castor bean. Some photos from the trials. You can see on above castor bean in Sardinia and switchgrass again, and then carinata in Uruguay and the biogas right model on the bottom. So you wonder why we have in each value chain more than one case study. One, it was used for model, for audit. It was real case study, totally well established, and we want to organize the audit for the low-ILUC certificate. But because the partners were experienced on low-ILUC feedstock, growing this kind of crops, we had existing trials, and despite the fact that this project is not a typical research project, but is a coordination and support action, we had the trials, and we thought to include more to be able to present more activities, and moreover, to do the open labs visits. So you can say the first Kenya, it was one of the audit. It was organized by Eni. You can see that although it was organized totally manually because Kenya it's not the typical agriculture like us, we got yields between 1.5 and 2.5 tons per acre. That was very good, and oil yield content between 40 and 50%. The second case study was again from Eni in Sardinia, and from there we had an open lab to discuss the harvesting, and we had the opportunity to see the harvesting machinery. That is an important issue I will explain later about castor bean. And the third one, it was a trial in Greece where we are trying to grow castor bean under no tillage condition. That is very important to see how the crop can deal without the conventional system to prepare the soil. You can see that the yields were very promising, more than 1 tons per hectare, and the possibility for castor bean is more than 3 tons per hectare seeds. Some more photos, you can see the crop here, castor bean at several stages of growth, how the crop looks with 2 plants when it's full maturity and at harvesting. Keep in mind that castor bean, if you want to organize better the harvesting in the Mediterranean region, you need somehow to stop the growth of the crop. So early September, if you want to organize the harvesting, you have to spray the crop to stop the vegetation period and to organize the final harvest. It's very difficult to do it without this. But what we are trying to do in another project in Midas, we try to develop bioherbicide in order to spray the crop and organize, not to use typical chemical herbicides. And I hope in 1 or 2 years we have good results on this. You see how we spray and we organize the harvesting. A big issue. Let me go to the next. Some more photos from this trial. You can see here, this is very nice photo because you can see that, you can see the straw from the previous cultivation. We didn't prepare anything, we just sprayed and we go directly to sowing. And it was fantastic to see that the mulch protect to have additional weeds and at the same time kept the moisture in the soil. So we continue this trial for the 3rd year and we are very happy for this. Keep in mind that a big issue for castor bean, and I will explain later, is the harvesting, the mechanical harvesting. Despite this problem, the crop has a fantastic future and very very high yields. But we have to solve the harvesting of this crop. Let's move to the second case study that is abandoned land, but here we go with 3 perennial grasses. So the audit was in UK, it was Miscanthus, it was presented, but here I just give you an idea about the second choice. we can say miscanthus is perfect for central and north of Europe, but for the poor Mediterranean people that there is a lack of water, we can say switchgrass can be an alternative, because we go to the flowering phase quite early, let's say June. That means if you see the crop start flowering, means no more water is needed, and it's the same time that we have the hot period in the Mediterranean area. So this is a trials for more than 20 years, different varieties, a different application. Keep in mind, we harvest every January after a killing frost. Is the same with miscanthus, and in marginal land, the mean yields was above 10 tons per hectare as a mean of 12 years, of 20 years. That is very important, because you can say that I can take an estimation that if I have a field, 20 years occupation the land, and I can expect 10 tons dry matter. And keep another issue, when you harvest the crop, the moisture content is between 20 and 30%. That is very important for some thermochemical process. Again, this is the one that I told you, mean yields around 10 tons per hectare. As all the other perennials, the maximum, the ceiling yields is between year 2 and 5, but it's important in the perennial to know what you can expect and how long in order to do your estimations. This is just one graph for the audit from UK. Here we did the audit, and here everything was mechanical. And in this area, there are several trials that established at different time frames, and the results were very good. Here is the biogas done right model. Here we have in the same area of land to propose a nice rotation that we can include food and non-food crops, and the energy crops to be in between in the empty places of the rotation if possible, and not affect the yields of the food crops. And this was one of the case studies that last month we have a nice open lab, and if you follow you can see some photos from this day. In Greece, in another project, what we tested a rotation where after wheat that we used to grow, we put some hemp that is Ehibition, and then we tested next year maize. You can see the yields here, and we had also a poster for this in the poster area, where apart from wheat and sun hemp, we test additional rotation. And what we saw after 5 years, that the yields of wheat or corn, they didn't affect it, and the yields of corn and wheat was at least the same when in the empty places, in the place that the soil was uncovered, we insert other hemp or sun hemp or kenaf or sorghum. There are many posters for this in biomass resources. Here you can see some hemp that we got even 24 tons per hectare. And why some hemp I propose for biogas done right model? Because it has high moisture content, and at the harvesting usually has 60 to 70% moisture. Some photos from our last audit from Brasca Carinata in Uruguay. You can see here we had UPM that assist and was responsible for these value chains. You can see photo at several stages of growth. The yields was above 1.5 tons per hectare, even 2.7 in some cases. The oil content was at least 42%. Keep in mind Uruguay has the opposite climate for us, and usually when we grow it in Europe, we used to have the harvesting in June, but in Uruguay the climate is totally different. Some photos from another trial that I established this year in the framework of another project, Carina. We have here the coordinator, Federica Zanetti from University of Bologna. So you can see some photos from this year. We expect to have the harvesting next month. But Brassica carinata is a crop that it cannot be considered the typical catch crop because the growing cycle is relatively long, and we can say that if we want to find another oilseed to be a catch cover crop, this can be camelina or cranberry. And let's go to some take-home message. This is my last slide. If we go to castor bean can give at least 1.5. I put very low productivity here because in the trials we got even 4 tons per hectare, but I try to be modest and to say the minimum. But what is the problem? We had the hybrid. We have the nice hybrids. We know how to grow. It's very well developed in the Mediterranean. A big issue is to organize better the mechanical harvest. There are companies in Italy that develop new handlers for the harvesting, but still we need to improve these value chains. For the perennials, we can say, as I told you before, miscanthus can be very well fit in Central North Europe, while switchgrass can be a very nice alternative for the dry marginal areas of the Mediterranean region. Carinata is a great option, but we have a problem with the seed. There is only one company producing now seed, so it's a problem that we had to consider. Now there are many new projects like Carina, studying Carinata in very detail, even as summer cover crop. And Carinata has in the place of the project, you can find leaflets, you can see what is the project. I hope to have nice data next year to present. And instead of carinata, we can say, we can think about of other alternative oilseeds like camelina. And biogas done right model is very important. We work with CIP that in the real case study, and in Greece, we work on the case study of wheat, sun hemp, and then corn, and work very well and didn't affect the yields of wheat and corn. This was for me. We're going to close the project in 2 months, and keep follow us because now we're going to upload several deliverables with the final findings. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Efi. Yeah, just to mention, you can find already some very interesting reports on the website. And I forgot to mention before, Chris and George worked on a series of briefing notes together with their teams regarding different aspects of the, let's say, issues related with the low ILUC risk feedstock. And you can also find this on the bike website. So now time to move on. I will invite Caterina Borchi from Record, who has done an interesting work regarding the replicability potential of the bike case studies that we just saw in Efi's presentation. You can use the pointer.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good morning to everyone. So my name is Caterina Borchi. I work for Record, and today I will present our results from the replicability potential assessment of the 4 bike case studies in Europe. So first, just a few slides about the methodology that we adopted. So to assess the potential of replication of the four case studies in Europe, we started with the first phase of data collection, in which we gathered different information from different sources and databases related, for example, to the position of the biorefineries or the extension of the cultivated and underutilized lands in Europe. Then we had a second phase of data elaboration and integration, in which we modeled the yield of the target crops, and we evaluated the potential of biomass and the biofuel production. And then a last phase of identification of the most promising countries and case studies. As was already said before, the first value chain is about the cultivation in unused, abandoned, and severely degraded lands. And here we have the 2 case studies identified from the bike project. So for these two case studies, we identified the target biorefineries, which are first and second generation bioethanol plants. For the first case study about perennial grasses cultivation for bioethanol production, and HVO and biodiesel plants for castor oil cultivation for renewable diesel production. Then we estimated the yield of the target crops, which are switchgrass and miscanthus for the first case study and castor for the second, in the underutilized lands of Europe, which you can see in the map on the right. And we then evaluated the potential biomass production, considering different supply distances from the biorefineries. As regards the second value chain, which is about productivity increased from improved agricultural practices, we have other two case studies. And as regards the first one, so the Brassica carinata cultivation as a cover crop for renewable diesel production, we identified the target biorefineries, we modeled the yield in the European Mediterranean area, and then we also identified two different crop rotation schemes, one for the summer variety and one for the winter variety, in which integrate Brassica for cultivation as a cover crop. For biogas done right model, we first identified the top countries of Europe in terms of biomethane potential from cover crops, in terms of number and installed capacity of the biogas plants, and also in terms of level of development of the natural gas grid. And then we evaluated the potential biomethane production, considering a 90% upgrade of the existing biogas plants. So let's start with the results of the first case study. Here you can see the output of the biorefineries identification. So for this case study, the second generation bioethanol plants and also the first generation bioethanol plants, which we considered in our work and our deliverable, but which I will not show in this presentation. And here you can see the output of the modeling of the yield of switchgrass on the left and miscanthus on the right, which was done through a modeling system developed by FAO called GAETS. And we then integrated the simulated yield in all European area with the map available of underutilized lands, as you can see on the right. And we calculated the potential biomass production, first considering a supply distance of 70 kilometers, and then a supply distance of 150 kilometers, just to compare when the distance is doubled. In order to identify the most promising case studies, we set a threshold of 100,000 tons of dry biomass per year per biorefinery as a minimum production value. So for this case study, the most promising countries that we have identified, so that had a good combination of extension of underutilized lands and also attainable yields of the target crops, are Romania, Spain, Slovakia, and Poland. We also then evaluated the potential biofuel production, considering in this case study a conversion factor of around 176 liters of bioethanol per ton of dry biomass. And then the output we obtained ranges from around 80,000 tons of bioethanol per year in Poland to 156,000 tons per year of bioethanol in Romania. Now the results of the second case study. So for Castor, we considered the Mediterranean area, and we selected 5 HVO plants, 3 operational and 2 planned for the future. And then we also selected the 3 biodiesel plants, specifically in those areas in which HVO technology is not established yet. For example, southeastern Italy and Greece. For Castor, it was not possible to model the yield using the modeling system that we used for the perennial grasses, since Castor was not available in any data set. So we tried to estimate the yield of this crop starting from the available literature. So we collected the papers regarding the castor cultivation trials in the Mediterranean countries and compared these reported data with the results obtained from the bike activities and open labs. And then to stay in a conservative scenario, we chose the lowest yield reported for each country. We then evaluated the potential oil production, first considering a supply radio of 230 kilometers from the biorefineries, then so both for HVO and biodiesel, and then expanding the distance to 500 kilometers, so covering all the selected countries. And for this case study, we set a threshold of 20,000 tons of oil per year as a minimum production value for the identification of the most promising case studies. So these are the results that we obtained. We also then calculated the potential HVO and biodiesel production, considering conversion factors of 0.7 for HVO and 0.95 for biodiesel. So the results range from around 44,000 tons of HVO in Italy to around 650,000 tons of HVO in Spain per year. Now the third case study, the biorefineries are the same that we selected for the castor bean case study. And the yield was simulated in the Mediterranean area using the GUIDES modeling system and assimilating Brassica carinata to Brassica anacus, which was available in the GUIDES dataset. We then integrated this layer with another layer that we retrieved from the MAGIC project, and that shows the areas of suitability both for the summer variety and for the winter variety. And we then considered only those areas identified as suitable for the assessment. As regards the rotation schemes, we identified 2 different rotational cropping systems in which Brassica could be integrated both as a summer cover crop and as a winter cover crop. So as regards the summer cover crop, Brassica is considered in alternation with winter cereals and leguminous once every 4 years in place of a fallow period. And as regards the scheme for the winter cover crop, Brassica is considered as cultivated in alternation with corn and cotton summer cultivation and winter cereals once every 4 years. And it is important to highlight that these schemes developed can be interpreted as general schemes that can be adjusted according to the local environmental and economic conditions. Then, to assess the potential oil production of Brassica, we considered the land dedicated to winter cereal cultivation for the Brassica summer variety and to corn and cotton cultivation for the Brassica winter variety at a sub-regional level. And we then considered as well different supply distances of 230 kilometers and also 500 kilometers. And the threshold we set was the same that we set for castor of 20,000 tons of oil per year. And this is the output for the scenario with Brassica as a winter variety, and the summary of the results that we obtained. In this case, we have Spain as the most promising country, followed by Italy and Greece. Now let's skip to the last case study. So as I anticipated before, we first identified the top countries in terms of biomethane potential from cover crops. So we collected information from a previous study, which indicates Italy, France, and Germany as the 3 top countries. As regards, as I said, the biomethane potential from cover crops. Then we identified the top countries in terms of natural gas level of development. And in this case, we identified as top countries Italy, Germany, France, and the UK. And then we also evaluated the number of installed biogas plants and of operating biogas plants and installed capacity. And we chose Italy, Germany, France, and UK as the target countries for this replicability assessment. So the output that we obtained, as I said, considering an upgrading of 90% of the existing biogas plants, show a biomethane potential production for Italy of around 3 billion cubic meters per year, of around 2 billion cubic meters per year for France, and a much higher potential for Germany, which has a much higher number and installed capacity of biogas. And the potential calculated is around 13 billion cubic meters per year. And last, for UK, around 1.3 billion cubic meters per year. Finally, the conclusions. As regards the first case study, we identified the 4 target countries for an overall bioethanol potential of 400,000 tons per year. For the second case study, we identified the 3 target countries, and these are the overall potential that we evaluated both for HVO and biodiesel. As regards the third case study, we identified the 3 target countries and an overall potential production of around 3,000 tons of HVO and 66,000 tons per year of biodiesel. And finally, for biogas done right model, we identified the 4 target countries and the biomethane potential of around 18 billion cubic meters per year. The follow-up that we highlighted are an update of the castor and the brassica yield in Europe, which, as I said, were not available in any of the online modeling tools and databases, and also a new data required for the brassica performance as a summer cover crop, which has a much higher potential if compared to the winter cover crop, but of which we still actually don't know which could be the performance. And then for the biogas done right model, an update of the current status of biogas plants, since for our work we used country-specific databases, which have had actually different levels of precision and also different years of reference. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Caterina. Thank you. We also managed to recover some delay. So now I would like to invite Peter Avigos from ICC to speak now, who has worked in the bike project on the very important issue of the certification scheme for certifying the low ILUC risk feature of the crops. So Peter, the floor is yours. You can use the pointer.
Yeah, thank you very much for the nice introduction, and thank you very much for listening to our presentation and to the overall results of the bike projects. Before I start to explain in more detail what we did as part of the bike project, I think it's important to first of all explain what ISCC is doing, how sustainability certification works, and then I will try to explain the main findings and the output of the work package that ISCC conducted as part of the bike project. So in order to start to explain ISCC is a sustainability certification schemes. And you see some rough numbers on ISCC here. So since becoming operational in 2010, we have issued now more than 45,000 certificates. And currently, in order to have a rough number, we have more than 8,100 valid certificates. This means system users, companies who are using ISCC in order to prove compliance to sustainability requirement in the respective market. ISCC is organized in a way that we are backed up by the so-called ISCC Stakeholder Association. And this is an association of currently more than 230 members, meaning companies, associations, NGOs who are part of this stakeholder network, I would say, and who are supporting the further development of ISCC. And that's very important to understand. ISCC is a multi-stakeholder approach and was developed based on the feedback from companies coming from the agriculture sector, from the forestry, from the biofuel sector, chemical industry, NGOs, and so on. So that's important to understand. And that's also important maybe to understand the last steps of our project here. ISCC operates 3 certification schemes. On the left-hand side, you can see ISCC EU. This is a certification scheme for the biofuels market here in Europe. And Chris already explained in his presentation the R&D framework which is in place and the Commission setting out requirements for low ILUC risk certification. So this is if companies want to produce biofuels and want to bring this into the European market and would like to ensure that those are accounted against the respective quotas, then those biofuels need to be certified against one of the recognized certification schemes recognized by the European Commission. And ISCC EU is one of those schemes being recognized and can be used by companies in the biofuel sector. On the right-hand side, you can see ISCC CORSIA. This is the scheme that we are operating for the sustainable aviation fuels market. So we have ICAO, the international organization for the aviation sector. They also set out sustainability requirements. They also set out a kind of certification approach, and ISCC CORSIA is recognized there. And we have the same principles as we have it with the R&D framework and ISCC EU. And in the middle, you see ISCC Plus. This is our certification scheme for the voluntary market. So companies in the food and feed sector, and mainly in the chemical industries, those companies are using this certification schemes in order to prove compliance to voluntary sustainability requirements in their markets. And it's important to understand that we developed our approach and we worked as part of the bike project under the ISCC Plus scheme, because under ISCC EU, the EU Commission set out the requirement for low-ILUC certification. Under ISCC CORSIA, we have ICAO who is setting out the framework and the requirements, but under ISCC Plus, there's certain flexibility. And as part of the bike projects, we were able to develop an approach for low-ILUC certification under the certification scheme. Okay, how does sustainability certification works under ISCC and in principle under most of the sustainability certification schemes in the market? The idea is to certify each relevant element in the supply chain individually. So here's an example, a very short supply chain. We have production of agricultural biomass, for example, on farm plantation level, or when we talk about waste and residue feedstocks, which are being collected, then we talk about a point of origin. This is always the starting point of the supply chain. And we directly start at the beginning of the supply chain with the certification process. And then after this, we always have a so-called first gathering point or collecting point, which is the first element in the supply chain, picking up the sustainable biomass from the producer or from the point of origin. And then afterwards, we have processing units, meaning companies who are processing the sustainable input material into a sustainable output material, or we have different traders with or without storages. And all of these elements in the supply chain must be certified individually. All of these must have a certificate in place. And this is very important because we want to ensure traceability throughout the whole supply chain, from farm level to the final consumer. Relevant information must be transferred in the supply chain, and you must be able to trace back from the market to the producer of the sustainable biomass at the beginning of the supply chain. And this is what ISCC is establishing, and of custody requirements in place. I will not go into detail, but that's the approach of sustainability certification. Also important to understand, a farmer usually does not know where his feedstock, where his product ends up, in which market. They are selling this to the first gathering point, and then the first gathering point is selling this to processing unit traders. There can be several steps in the supply chain, but farmers do not know this. And if you want to certify low-ILUC risk produced feedstocks at the beginning of the supply chain, you must focus on farms, because there the relevant criteria must be fulfilled. And for the rest of the supply chain, this is at the end of the day only mass balancing. But key is to certify farmers at the beginning of the supply chain. This was the starting point also for our approach. Under ISCC, you can certify each feedstock which is being produced on farm level. So every crop which is being cultivated by a farm or by plantation can be certified under ISCC. Here you can see some examples. And please also keep in mind that ISCC is an international scheme. So we have system users in more than 120 countries. So at the end of the day, everything being cultivated in agriculture can be certified under ISCC. And in order to prove compliance to our sustainability requirements, farms and plantations must prove that they are in line with our 6 principles for sustainable biomass production. Principle 1 is protection of land, or protection of land with high biodiversity value or higher carbon stock. Principle 2 are good agricultural practices. Principle 3, safe working conditions. Principle 4, compliance with human and labor rights. Principle 5, compliance with land rights, laws, and international treaties. And Principle 6, good management practice. And behind these 6 principles, we have in total, and Andrea already mentioned this in the first presentation, 96 criteria which must be fulfilled by farms plantation. And only if this is the case, then they can get certified, and then they can bring their sustainable product into the market. So this is the starting point. This is the basic sustainability certification that we have in place under ISCC. And on top of that, our approach was to introduce and to implement further requirements for low-ILUC risk certification. So if farmers want to produce low-ILUC risk feedstock, then they first of all must fulfill the basic requirements, and then they must comply with the requirements in a so-called add-on, which is covering the low-ILUC risk criteria. So how to produce low-ILUC risk biomass? In principle, we have 2 approaches. Chris also mentioned this in his presentation. Approach 1 is to produce additional yield on land where you already are cultivating crops. So a farmer must prove that he is implementing a certain measure which ensures that additional biomass is being produced. And then this additional biomass can be claimed as low ILUC risk. That's one option, to increase the production based on an additionality measurement. The second approach is to produce biomass on land where at this point in time you didn't have any kind of agricultural practices in place. So cultivation on unused, abandoned or severely degraded land. That's the second approach. And farmers can choose one of these approaches, and then we have a certain set of sustainability requirements which must be fulfilled. But always keep in mind the basic sustainability requirements. This is the starting point. This must be fulfilled, and then the add-on can be implemented by the farmer. First of all, to the second approach, a few words. This is quite attractive for farmers to go for this approach. So to start cultivating on unused, abandoned or severely degraded land. And the reason for that is because all of the biomass that you are producing can be claimed as low ILUC risk. And that's different to the other approach, to the one where you're increasing yields on already cultivated areas, because there only the additionally produced biomass can be claimed as low ILUC risk. But if you start on unused land, abandoned or severely degraded land, you start with zero and all the biomass you are producing can be claimed as low ILUC risk. And there are also certain benefits. I would not go into that much of detail, but you have some easier ways to fulfill the criteria, because at least on abandoned and severely degraded land, there is no need of a proof of additionality, and you do not need to prove that you have an additionality measure being implemented. So further ways which makes life easier for farmers. That's one approach. The other one, as already explained, you are increasing yields on already cultivated land, and for that you must show to the auditor that you have implemented a so-called additionality measure, meaning something which is the reason why you are producing additional biomass. And here we have a list of different additionality measures which can be implemented in principles, and which from our perspective are things that can be implemented by farmers to increase the yields. What is quite important here, what I would like to highlight, is that parts of this list are based on the work of other working packages in our project. So there was some kind of cooperation between the different working packages. And I like to thank my colleagues for making these kind of proposals that we have further additionality measures to include on this list. But these are the two approaches in principle, how to produce this low ILUC risk biomass. And then in order to test this, Effie already explained this in her presentation, we conducted 4 pilot audits. I will not go into detail, but it's important from my perspective to understand that as part of a certification scheme, in order to describe what auditors need to verify on site, and in order to describe for farmers what kind of requirements they need to fulfill, you usually have system documents in place. And if you go to the IECC homepage, you will find a lot of system documents explaining our requirements and explaining the way how to get certified. And in addition to that, there are documents for the auditors which are used during the audit, so that they have a checklist where they are going through to control whether the farmer is in line with the requirements. And we have documents for the farmers, so kind of checklists, which helps them what needs to be taken into account. And all of these documents were part of this project here. So we first of all developed draft documents, and then those were tested in the pilot audits. And I would like to thank, on the one hand side, our pilot partners here, the 4 companies, which were part of the project, but also the auditors who conducted the audit, because they were very helpful, because those auditors provided a lot of feedback on the documents, on the approach based on their experience. So this was also part of the whole process, to include the auditees on the one hand side, but also the auditors in further developing the documents. So overall, we try to combine information on low ILUC risk certification from a lot of different sources. So what the EU Commission sets out, feedback from the pilot farmers, the pilot companies, feedback from the auditors and the certification bodies, the project partners. The example was the list of additionality measures, the other work package contributions, and also the IECC stakeholders. I will explain this in the coming slide, and we combined this, and then we developed this system document, which you can see here, which is at the end of the day, the relevant document which must be implemented into the, into the certification scheme ISCC. And I already explained at the beginning, ISCC is a multi-stakeholder approach. So if we try to implement something new, there's always a kind of public consultation with our stakeholders. And this was also part of the process here. So we developed a draft system document, and then this was put into public consultation, providing the option for all of our stakeholders, ISCC association members, system users, to provide feedback on this document. And then we took this all together, we made an update of this document, and at the end of the day, we have a final system document which now can be used by system users under ISCC+. And this was, at the end of the day, the story of our working package as part of the bike project, because at the beginning of the project, the challenging part was to develop a certification approach under ISCC+. I think we were successful. We have a system document in place. We have the relevant documents for auditors and auditees in place, which can be used. And so from now on, under ISCC+, companies can get certified under this low ILUC risk approach and improve compliance to those requirements. And I think that this overall project bike, of course, was successful, but also for our working package, I think we fulfilled what we promised at the beginning of this project. And that's it. I would like to thank all the project partners again, the farms where we were able to conduct our pilot audits, as well as the auditors who really helped us, a lot of valuable feedback, our project partners, and thank you very much for your attention here. And in case there are any questions popping up, if we have time, I'm happy to answer those. If not, I'm also available after the session. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Peter. So just to clarify, we will have around 20-30 minute time for an open discussion towards the end before our lunch that will be served here outside. So I will invite the first panelist of the day, so David Chiaramonti from Polito and Record, who will talk about, on behalf of the Bio4A project, which is also the co-organizer of this event, we talk about the relation between safe, sustainable aviation fuels and low ILUC risk biomass feeds. So.
Thank you very much, Giulio. Yeah, well, actually, yes, when we wrote Bike with Calliope Imperial College, this project was ongoing, and you know, this is an experimental work, and Bike was a accompanying action on the regulation, certification, and you know, overall approach, a software kind of work with the support of experimental work. So I will come back to that. Bio4A has a double nature. One is full industrial, to produce 1,000 tons of HEFA in additional capacity, industrial capacity. This was the goal. The other goal was to produce research data on very degraded land to generate lipids, because HEFA is fed with lipid, and HEFA today is the only route to aviation fuel, practically at industrial scale, I mean, of course, and this will stay until 2030, 2035, more likely, for sure. So aviation fuels, yesterday we had a workshop with Ethiopian colleagues and Exergia, George is here. Most of that discussion was how to produce sustainable lipids for the aviation industry, because there's no alternative. And then, of course, the balance. So, which plants exist in our country? The first one to be converted is Porto Marghera near Venice. The Porto Marghera refinery is about 350,000 ton feed in lipids that was renewed. You have to consider that otherwise this would be just a deposit of fuels, tanks, the same for Gela. So the overall concept of converting existing refinery to a bio-based economy also is not only to be seen under the environmental and industrial point of view, but also under the social point of view. So from some 1,000 people in these EU refineries, you really lose a lot of jobs if they become just deposits, no? So this is an important point. Then this has been done quite some years ago, and it was in place the moment we were starting that project. Most of this conversion, or all the conversion, as stated by our colleague from ENI in the natural workshop, was initially conceived for palm oil. And I understand how these things develop, because it's more or less the same way of thinking of the oil industry. Instead of oil, crude oil, they were moving to crude palm oil, but you know, the mentality was the same. So the first thing I see clearly in the, and we discussed a lot with the Commission this point, still today to me is a problem. These are biofuels. They analyze this chain as a fuel, but they do not invest in much of their time in the bio value chain that is a biofuel. So it means to deal with agriculture, forestry, all the things that are in the upstream. And that probably for us here is an obvious thing, but still is not at all. I do not refer to ENI. Now I'm referring to the European Commission and to the European institutions, first of all. Approaching this still with a view of the oil industry, but that's a bioeconomy issue, completely different. Then it came the conversion of the Gela refinery, which is in Sicily, much bigger, which is being converted. In this project, we initially had another partners, another oil major that has been substituted by the ENI company at a certain moment for a number of reasons. And it was very, very complicated project, because after just less than a month they entered the project, there was a fire in this refinery. So for a year, everything was blocked by the court, because, you know, when in a refinery you have a fire, the first thing that happens is that you block everything and try to dig into the issue and so on. So it was really a challenge. In parallel to that, the lipid price skyrocketed to well above 2,000 euro, 2,200 euro per ton, just of the feedstock. Here, this project was using used cooking oil for the industrial part, or other, let's say, residual lipid, palm oil, meal effluent, for instance, or mix of that. So we really had a number of technical and economic issues. So I'm really glad to say that last week, 1,000 tons of HEFA has been delivered after blending. So it's more than 1,000 blended. So thank you. Thank you. It was really a challenge to Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. So now this is delivered in the regular kerosene distribution system. So it's not segregated mode. It's treated as jet fuel, as a fossil, I mean, in the Schiphol Airport system. And we have to thank Sky Energy and KLM, beyond that, ENI, of course, for the significant effort. Here you see some picture what means to charge the ship. We experienced problems in charging the ship, and I have to report the same happened in a previous project, Ithaca. Again, contamination during distributions, it's not trivial at all, and we have seen these things happen and had to be solved. SAF is the most challenging type of fuel. Any minor contamination is, you know, off spec, and that means the ship becomes off spec. Cannot happen, of course. And then other technical matters related to these things. Okay, that was the industrial part. Just to give you a dimension, as I said, if you combine Gela and Porto Marghera, overall you already have 1.2 million tons feed in. And there are plans by ENI announced to increase very much the volume that has to be treated. There is also a phase that refers to the separation of the diesel-like fuels, the HVO, from the kerosene. And this has been done in another site, which is Livorno. So the lipids came to Gela, and Gela, the HVO plus HEF has been produced. Then this has been transported to Livorno, a completely new installation for this. In that place, the distillation of HVO, naphtha HVO, again, another new stream, has been done. The The HEPA component has been charged to this vessel. It has been transported to the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, KLM carried out the blending operation, and then this has been delivered to the Schiphol airport. But there is a part that is very, very much related to bike, to African, or in any case, castor or brassica seeds. That is to produce sustainable lipids from marginal land, or let's say severely degraded land, because marginal land as a term doesn't exist legally. We have to stick to the regulation. Severely degraded land means, according to the GRED 2 Delegated Act, a land that is low in carbon content, that is eroded. These are the two main issues. Marginality instead is more related to an economic concept now, when the farmer doesn't find very economic to continue cultivation. Imperial College studies in the European framework assessed in 8.5 million hectares in the Mediterranean areas, in only the European countries in the Mediterranean areas, the amount of land that is marginal. Here we did a number of things. We delivered a compost, biochar, and co-composted biochar and organic matter after digestion. The co-composting helps to maintain nitrogen and other nutrients which are absorbed by the biochar into the material. We made a number of tests there, and this has been replicated in new lysimeters that we built that are in operation at record. And camelina and barley have been cultivated in rotation. So this is an experimental evidence of the reverse ILUC concept. So that is something I want to work a lot in the coming years. ILUC has been a blocking factor to the biofuel chain. And one can discuss probably an entire workshop about ILUC. I don't want to do, but that is a case of reverse ILUC, because this land in Spain would be completely unproductive without intervention on the soil. So we intervene in the soil, and then barley and camelina are being produced. Of course, it remains a difficult soil, so you cannot pretend to have the yield that you have elsewhere. But the interesting thing, in conjunction with the DG Clima work that is going on in these days, the meeting on carbon farming is 21st and 22nd of June in Brussels, and will be webcasted, so you can see this, is that now we open another door, which is carbon sequestration in the soil. So you see there are a number of factors. The energy can pay for soil recovery and can generate carbon credits and deliver land for low ILUC or reverse ILUC feedstock all together on the same land. Economic conditions are, coming. In Europe, we will have a revision of the ETS scheme 2026, which is quite soon, tomorrow. So if we can combine all the elements, maybe, or at least I believe, we can find a business case, given the low yield. In bike, we also have another chain that is not reported here, which is the decentralized production of biomethane. Thanks to the current decree, the regulation that is in place in Italy, and the conversion of the biomethane into methanol or Fischer-Tropsch product in a centralized place. So we use the gas grid as we use the electric grid with photovoltaics, exactly the same thing. I produce in a distributed manner, like with PV, and I have a centralized collection of the same amount to convert this into a number of fuels, methanol, SAF, and other. Well, okay, we have carried out also other things. Now, just if I still have a few minutes, just a few words about the ESCA factor. Well, this ESCA factor is a number, but let me skip to this one. ESCA is, if you see the first formula, this formula is the greenhouse gas performance of the fuel. So if I produce ethanol or biodiesel or HVO or whatever, In this formula, in Annex 5, Part C of the Renewable Energy Directive, you find the carbon in soil issue. It's easy, straight to understand, not so obvious instead how to do with ISCC. I know the difficulty in translating this into an implementation, how to measure, how to calculate. Anyway, this ESCA factor basically considers the difference before and after the intervention, or before and after the sustainable agronomic, or the variation of the carbon in soil. And here is, to my very personal opinion, where biochar plays a fantastic role. Yesterday or the day before yesterday, we have seen the data from Andrea Parenti, University of Bologna. It's really minor increase in soil organic carbon from 50 to 60 or so. Of course, it's welcome. But when you come to the implementation, you have to measure this small variation of carbon in soil over a long period. I see big issues from the operator point of view. Second element is the labile carbon. This carbon will be elaborated quickly in the soil. So if you look from the perspective of sequestering carbon, it's very arguable. Anyway, this is matter for DG Clima carbon farming, and will be elaborated in the coming years, even a position by the Commission, what they want to go. But what I can say, if you carbonize, and if you put 2 tons of carbon there from the castor residues, for instance, they will stay there for a very long time. There was a very interesting workshop at JRC on geological sequestration of carbon through biochar. It's known, it's demonstrated, it's an IPCC document. We know it will stay for very large time, well beyond 100 years, which is what we consider. So we can improve the greenhouse gas performance of the fuel that is produced by carbonizing the residue. There is more carbon in the residues than in the oil. Don't forget this. There are more tons of sequestered carbon in the residues that goes back to the soil. So we don't remove it from the soil, we keep it in the soil. There's more carbon there than in the fuel itself that goes back to the atmosphere.
Don't forget the nutrients at the highest phosphorus levels. I mean,
that's another point. Nutrients can even be extracted if we want, but it doesn't need it if it goes to the soil. In other value chain, in biochar, in steel, we first extract the nutrients from the biochar and then we use the carbon. So there are a number of options. The RED 2 implementing regulation says that shall be measured on soil carbon stocks before and after intervention. So the European systems, different from what is in discussion in Corsia for SAF, for instance, is based on measurements. And here is where the tricky thing comes, because you have, imagine UPM, 10,000 hectares of brassica, and you have to sample in a statistically representative way how much carbon is there before and after, no? And that's one point. However, there is, in the regulation, there is a window that opens that after some year from the baseline, the increase in soil carbon can be estimated based on representative experiment or soil model. So, you know, there's a slight opening in the European regulation to say, okay, first measure, but then if you show me that your model is consistent with the measurement in time, we could consider using models. That is a very, very, very important point from my view. Biochar has the highest carbon removal, threshold. 45 grams CO2 equivalent per megajoule of biofuel that is produced there. So what's going on, for example, with castor in Mediterranean area or African, in that case, country? Castor is cultivated, oil is extracted, and it's not an easy oil to extract. The cake, which is poisoning, is planned to be pyrolyzed immediately, so to remove any issue with the protein that is dangerous. At the same time, you create carbon credits on the voluntary market for the moment, maybe in the future, after 2026, in the mandated market. So it means 100 euro per ton of CO2, which is 150, 100 euro per ton of carbon, plus the value of the carbon, plus the value of the fuel. So maybe you can start reaching economic balance. But all this work has to be developed, because from this regulation to the implementation, what Peter was saying before, I mean, one thing is to define the main routes. That's okay. But then you have to translate this into a methodology that has to, how do you sample the soil? How do you measure the carbon with different agronomic procedures? If you add biochar, it's not the same as mulching or no tillage or whatever, for instance. This kind of things needs a proper detailed definition, and that is still work to be done. A very important point, however, is that in this regulation, there is a list as example of essential soil management practices to promote soil carbon sequestration. What is really relevant for me is that there is a list. So in a European official document, we have a list of sustainable management practices. This was not there. Biochar is not yet there in the LULUCF regulation. So there are, you know, as Chris said, there is contrasting element in the European regulation. But the point is that we do have, and then our examples. Now, before that's the closing slide, just let me remark one final point, and then I go to the conclusion. Peter shortly mentioned, but it's really very important. I want to stress this element. One thing is Europe with this regulation. Outside Europe, we have different regulation. CORSIA for SAF has been mentioned. The sustainability criteria in CORSIA is 10% minimum greenhouse gas saving, but including ILUC. In Europe, we have minimum 65% without ILUC. In other systems like California, the advanced biofuels are defined on the basis of the greenhouse gas performance. From 50% greenhouse gas saving, you are advanced biofuels, and then there is a premium if you behave better, 55, 60, 70, whatever. In Europe, we have a threshold, 65%, but the ETS, emission trading scheme system, is working in a different way. And this will come in place in 2026 and will cover aviation and maritime. So, to conclude, if you produce the fuel and use the fuel in Europe, is one situation. If you produce it outside Europe, maybe for outside market, as was discussed yesterday with the Ethiopian colleagues, no? Where is this SAF going? Is it going to Europe, or is it going to the US or somewhere else, or for African use? Apart from the cost issue, which is a serious issue still. But this makes a big difference. If the feedstock is transported to Europe, it has to be compliant with European regulation, even if it's produced in Kenya or anywhere. If instead it goes to international aviation and not for flights departing from Europe, that's the refuel aviation regulation, it is subject to different rules. On EFA, just to summarize, we are very low now. So again, I see an issue with European policy now, because the targets are unrealistic under a certain point of view, because we are less than 0.05% of total consumption at the moment. So almost nothing. There's a ramp to go very quickly up with the SAF, and the only technology for this volume until at least 2035 that we have available is HEFA. Even if I still trust that from biogas, we could make SAF in an economic way, and this is rather unexplored yet with commercial. So there's no research, because we know how to convert methane to liquid fuels. It's industrial scale. So if we can develop a business model as we're trying to do in bike, maybe biomethane is ignored, but could be instead much more interesting for Italy. But for EFA, the key issue is to develop the supply chain. Very high yield crop, sustainable crop on marginal or degraded or land that is not capped. To investigate, say, the new type of crops, There are other detailed issues like book and claim and so that are also relevant. The last consideration, which was the one we used, we mentioned in the opening of this conference, ICAO says that if you substitute all the fossil fuels for aviation with sustainable aviation fuels, you can expect reasonably a range between 60 and 80% greenhouse gas reduction. So try to get a figure, try to visualize. It means that 20 to 40%, even if we substitute all the fuels with SAF, will have to be compensated. This is the dimension. It's an enormous dimension of compensation we will have to carry out. So the room for sustainable crop management practices, biochar, compost is enormous. And there are no alternative. I don't see any in this time frame. So we really have a highway in front of us that should be explored. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. So we have around 15 minutes left before our lunch that will be served outside, as I said. So maybe we can have some discussion as we had before. I also see some partners, other partners of the bike project here, like FAO or ENI. So I don't know if you want to start from there or if you have other comments related to what we saw in this presentation. Please feel free to raise your hand. Okay, Marco from FAO.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the presenters for these really interesting presentations. I'd just like to make a comment and perhaps a question also to link to what's been discussed before, the importance of coordinating between different systems. And this also perhaps is a question to sparkle the discussion with the presence of the Nigerian delegation. This question is addressed to Peter from ISCC. And my question is linked to the concept of underutilization of land or abandoned land. Based on standard, what is the mean of verification that ISCC mandates? And what is the role that local institutions, scientific institutions, can play in harmonizing this concept for international markets? The reason why I'm asking this question is because basically, is a farmer that does not utilize the land for 1 year considered the baseline eligible for unused land? What is it, a time frame for that? And how important it is to verify with local authorities and with local knowledge these aspects? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Regarding first of all, the definition. So we have unused land, abandoned land, severely degraded land. I think the relevant source here is clearly the European Commission. We have those land categories being defined under the RED framework, and this is more or less also the definitions that are being used in the market so far for biofuels as well as for sustainable feedstocks, for example, in the chemical industry. So we have a definition for abandoned land, for severely degraded land, and this needs to be taken into account. And how far local organizations may help here, to be honest, I don't know. At the end of the day, from a certification schemes perspective, those kind of land categories need to be determined by the auditor during the audit. There are different documents, tools that can be used to verify what kind of land category we have. So, for example, documents like history of land use on a certain area. There are tools in place using remote sensing data like the GRASS tool, which can be used to clearly determine how land area has been used in previous years. So this can be used in principle. And again, at the end of the day, from our perspective, the auditors needs to verify this. And this is a kind of standard procedure for the during the verification process. With respect to unused land, the definition clearly says 5 years land must be unused, meaning out of the rotation. And then this can be classified as unused. I think at the end of the day, this definition is coming from the CAP. I'm not sure about that. So the RED simply uses this, or the certification schemes. And again, this can easily be verified by documentation on land use, remote sensing data, and those kind of tools.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Quick reaction from Michael. Exactly. In fact, this is what I also thought. And because these type of verification measures require knowledge, isn't it difficult to find farmers equipped with the means to provide enough tools that are verifiable by ISCC without the support of local extension services and the local scientific community? Our job as FAO is to sometimes coach local institutions to actually work hand in hand with the farmers and then make them able to be certified. So I think there is some common ground here, if you agree. Thank you.
Just a quick question to ISCC as well. Is the low-ILUC add-on integrated into the ISCC EU and Corsia model already, or?
We need to speak on the microphone because there is people online also. Sorry.
Okay, for the EU model RED framework, the European Commission more or less sets out the requirements. We already have documents in place coming from the European Commission describing how low-ILUC risk certification should work. However, currently voluntary schemes are not recognized under these requirements. There are still some information missing, and this is an ongoing process. And so, yeah, at the end of the day, system users, farmers simply have to wait until this option is available as a kind of add-on. That's under the ISCC-EU certification scheme. For Corsia, the wording is a little bit different. It's LUC, not ILUC, but LUC. But there it is possible. So there this module add-on is already implemented, and we already have companies which are using this, proving compliance to these requirements. They are quite similar to what the Commission already explained under the RED framework. Small details are different, but there it is already possible.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments? Yeah, one here.
Can you please state your name and affiliation, please?
Okay. My name is Dr. Sunday Biki from Nigeria. So we are from the Nigeria Society of Engineers. So my question is maybe to you and your custodians. So we can see the performances in the yield in terms of maybe Spain, Italy, and is it Germany? Yeah. Can you really, what caused the performance in their behaviors? Be the yield in Italy was higher than the one in Spain, and the one in Spain is the one in Germany. So what do you conclude should be responsible for the variability in their performance? You check that. And two, how can we maybe use, you have used Kenya as a case study. How can we also use maybe Nigeria as a case study? And I am aware that in Europe, they have a stable climatic condition, but in Nigeria, we have variability in our climate change. So what will really be the impact of climate variability on the performances of your castle beans?
Well, it's a difficult question. So what we tried to do is to assess, let's say, the replicability potential of these case studies, considering the climate conditions of Europe. So specifically, for example, for castor and brassica, the climate conditions of the Mediterranean areas of Europe. And so what we obtained as a result is something that I think it's not fixed, but it depends a lot on the variability and the changes that in time may occur in climate. So I think and that for Nigeria, maybe the assessment would be related to that specific climatic conditions, which as well would not be fixed, but depending on the variation of year after year. So we tried to actually put together many different information in one single output, and we also found actually some difficulties. So many of those crops, for example, were not available in the modeling tools, like castor, for example. And for the other crops which were available, we tried to model what could be the yield of these crops considering different climatic scenarios. And the output I showed was a mean of these different scenarios, considering also different representative concentration pathways. But of course, you would have different output, for example, if you consider only the worst case scenario, and different output if you consider only the best case scenario. So I guess that it depends on the lot of parameters, so it's difficult to give a precise answer. But it's very important actually to try to do it, so to obtain some results that could be useful for future research.
Yeah, so basically we had to run a new simulation with Nigerian data, I guess. Yeah.
This was an initial European, it is a European project, and the idea initially for the replication, I think, was basically across Europe. So.
Yeah, but maybe with inserting new data on the different climatic zone, I think it can work out. So other questions, comments? Yeah, one at the back. Marit, one at the back. Yeah.
State your name.
My name is Engineer Ajabimbola from Lagos, Nigeria. A quick follow-up with what Dr. Joss raised. It will be better, since it's a European conference, you know, anywhere you see European, you see Nigeria, Africa in the meeting. It will be better that we have a balanced information, data, and as we are relating to Kenya, and there should be a big picture from other parts of West Africa, or to have a picture of what is obtainable. Now, going a little bit further to what the guy I just mentioned and the data presented on the screen. At interval, what Nigeria has in terms of soil reservation and other policy on ground, we need to look detail to compare to with other parts of Europe, now to have a balance that I know in a view, Europe have more standard policy and principle, but in some part of Africa, we have related information that we compare to each other. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think I could address to Kennedy from the Research Institute of Agricultural Economics from Hungary, and I could address those two questions from Nigerian counterparts. One on the addressing variability on the castor oil. I think these castor oil trials were led by ENI, and ENI has done lots of trials outside Europe in different climatic zones, especially in Latin America and also Africa. In Kenya, Zimbabwe, Rwanda, they are doing a lot of the trials. So this issue of climatic variability is being addressed through doing the phenotype or the genotype development in different climatic zones. And that is how ENI is capitalizing in African different climatic regions. Then for the question on the data supply, this goes back to the African countries. It's a question on how they supply data to the FAO, because this guy's model is from the AO and from the FAO, and the data FAO obtains from the National Statistics Bureau. So the question again goes back to the National Statistics Bureau on what type of data do they supply, how aggregated it is, and how complete it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Kennedy.
Good point.
Okay, there are no other questions, comments. I would like to remind you that there are already some interesting data available on the bike website, and in the last